So I am really chuffed to welcome Lisa Williams to the Creative Mornings Edinburgh virtual stage today. Lisa is the founder of the Edinburgh Caribbean Association, and she creates education programmes, arts events and walking tours to promote the shared heritage between Scotland and the Caribbean and exploring the possibilities of decolonisation and anti-racist practice. She is an honorary fellow of the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, and she also works as a consultant to the heritage organisations across Scotland. Lisa is going to be sharing her talk, Petrifying Memories from Real Wars to Culture Wars, with us this morning. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand you over to Lisa.
Good morning to everybody. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Here we go. Perfect. Okay, everybody see that okay? Give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Okay, I have a disclaimer. My disclaimer is I'm not a morning person. My friends, my good friends know this very well. So I think my brain is in somewhat of a good gear, but if I'm a little bit slow, it's because it's the morning. So there's so much to talk about with this topic. I have picked various images from Edinburgh and also from around the world just to show the kinds of debates that have been happening, the struggles that people have been having for decades and been ignored, the kinds of memorialization that happens in other places and how that connects to Edinburgh. And really what I want us to do is to think about the kinds of possibilities for memorialization. Who are we memorializing or continue to do so? Why are we doing so? What would we prefer to do if we had the power to do that in our own cities? So I'm also interested to hear what other folks have to say who are in different cities or live in different places, what different ideas. But I want us to think about, kind of expand our minds a bit, because one of the questions I get asked very often is, what would you do with the Melville monument? Would you pull it down? Would you put a plaque? We get stuck in binaries quite often, so I want us to kind of expand our minds to the kinds of things that we could do. I do quite a lot of work with schools as well, so I'm always really interested to hear what our young people have to say, the people that are going to be living with these statues for a lot longer than I will be, in my early 50s. And the kinds of ideas that they're having, whether that's creative responses to the monuments or other kinds of things. So I'm going to cram quite a fair amount of information into the next 20 minutes, so bear with me. We're going to start with, of course, the statue that I would imagine that everybody who's here today has heard about. So the Edward Colston statue, which came down in 2020, was taken down in 2020 and really has ignited that kind of debate right across the world. Now, of course, in lots of other places, these debates have been going on for a very long time. In Bristol itself, been going on for decades, especially from the African Caribbean community in Bristol, who were petitioning the council over and over again to just contextualise the life of Edward Colston. So yes, the fact he was a big philanthropist and donated money to create schools, a boys' school, what became a boys' school and a girls' school. Interestingly, those schools themselves, the students, and also as a result of a public consultation, have now just changed the names of those schools, which I think is interesting. And of course, thinking about the trial of the Colston Fall, which finished not that long ago. So if we think about the kinds of creative responses that we could have to these problematic statues, so somebody like Edward Colston involved in the member of the member of the Society of the Merchant Venturers in Bristol. Now, the Society of the Merchant Venturers in Bristol had a lot of people who were involved in the transatlantic slave trade and profited from that. And they are a society who've been quite invested in protecting the Colston brand. So with a lot of the arguments that went on with the council, it was also representatives from this particular society who weren't too happy with people wanting to tell a bit more of the truth about where Edward Colston was getting his money from, and being somebody who was very, very prominent in the transatlantic slave trade and trafficking, being responsible for directly trafficking people from West Africa in ships leaving Bristol and going to the Americas. So won't dwell on this for too long. We could talk about this, in fact, for a whole 20 minutes quite easily. But all of the arguments that happened in 2018, there was a plat that was agreed, was then vetoed in 2019. This is after decades of people talking about this and petitioning, and eventually pulled down in that famous incident that I'm sure everybody would have seen on the news at the time, or at least since that point. I think it's important for us to think about when this statue was put up. So this is many years after he was alive. It was actually put up by the Society of Merchant Venturers in 1895. It's not really that long ago. The reason it was put up by the Society was to memorialize him as a benefactor to the city and his philanthropy, particularly to those schools. Now, if we think about what happened with the Colston Fall, we had about 3,000 people that came out to support the Black Lives Movement that day. And of course, these people were put on trial because it was suggested that what they had done was criminal damage. The reason they got away from that and got away from a jail time was the people that were defending them were saying that the statue itself could be considered as a criminal offence, and the inaction of the council itself also considered as a criminal offence. I might want us to have a think about that as we get to a chat at the end of that about what you think of this. Now, of course, when the statue went down, it ended up in the M Shed Museum, as you can see here on the right-hand side, complete with its graffiti and with its damage. And they've had huge amounts of queues of people coming to visit the statue and think about it in a place where it's been recontextualized. Also, it's important for us to think about what happened after that trial as well. So all but one person in the jury acquitted them of any kind of offence of criminal damage. But there were people in the British government soon after who were suggesting actually they should have gone to jail for 10 years. And it's interesting to look at some of the really horrific crimes that people can commit against people, against children who would carry a similar kind of term, whether we think that's fair. And I think it's very important that we keep an eye on the kinds of laws that the government are trying to bring in. So not just the Nationality and Borders Bill, the protest bill that attracted a lot of fierce debate, a lot of opposition by Scottish MPs and Welsh MPs, which is great, but also looking at some of the intense backlash that was created in the right-wing news after they got acquitted as well. And I think it's really important that we keep an eye on that. So let's go to the next one. And of course, there's been ongoing attempts for slavery memorials. I don't know how many of you know about the Memorial 2007. Some of you might be very familiar with this. So this is an idea to place a memorial to memorialize the suffering of people that went through the experiences of being trafficked as part of the Atlantic slave trade and also under enslavement itself. So I want us to also think about, sort of interrogate this idea that people now are putting a present lens on the past and that we are falsifying history, and these kinds of ideas that are often knocked around by folks in the government, folks in heritage, but also in the press as well. So this is a quote from the founder of Memorial 2007. This is a group of people that have been trying to get this memorial put up in Hyde Park. Boris Johnson came out many years ago when he was mayor of London to say he was totally in support of it, and yet nothing's happened, even with what's happened since 2020. So I'm just going to read the quote here. Well, you can read that for yourself there. But what I want us to think about is what were people actually doing to history when they're putting up these statues in the first place? Are we going to think about this perhaps as falsifying history in a way, or hiding certain things that doesn't fit the narrative of what the leaders of Britain, the elite of Britain, want Britain to think about itself in that way? And if you want to join their campaign, I'm sure they'd be very grateful, because it's something that has been stalled over the years. Now, our monument in the centre of Edinburgh is the monument that's been attracting the most amount of attention over the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years, and definitely since 2020, when the Edinburgh Council decided that they were going to allow or agree to a change in the plaque put on the side of the monument. So what is interesting about this, and I think what a lot of people are not really aware of, is that 200 years ago, when it was put up, and it took several years for it to go up, and this is a few years after Henry Melville's death. For those of you who don't know much about Henry Melville, or Henry Dundas, Lord Melville, was somebody who was the most powerful person probably in the British government at the end of the 18th century, and certainly as a Scotsman. So somebody who was Home Secretary, he was Secretary of War, he was head of the Board of Control, so he's also involved in India, not just involved in India and providing opportunities for young men in Edinburgh to go out to really exploit people. And Edinburgh is part of the East India Company, which we have to remember had a military wing attached to it, and it's not as nice as it sounds. And also being somebody who put his friends or people that he was wanting to use for political favours, for example, in positions of power right across the Caribbean. So when we look at Scots as military leaders or of governors right across the Caribbean, it very often can trace it back to Melville putting them there in the first place. And there's lots of letters that you can read in the archives that go between Melville and those governors. So he's somebody who's there orchestrating the kinds of horrible events that happen right across the Caribbean. So we're talking about genocide, we're talking about massacres, we're talking about all sorts of things that I think a lot of people in Scotland don't really know too much about yet. Now, what's been the flashpoint and the main area of debate around this has been whether he was an abolitionist or not. 1792, he comes up with this idea of gradually abolishing the slave trade. He does at the time suggest that 1792 is too early and we can do this in 1800. And they have a compromise deal of 1796. Again, what a lot of people don't know is that around 1796, Britain had committed itself, so Lord Melville and Prime Minister Pitt, who's his good friend, they've committed themselves to sending out the biggest military mission that had ever left Britain. And it goes out to the Caribbean, headed up by a man who has a house in Edinburgh, so Sir Ralph Abercrombie. Pretty much every primary school kid in the Caribbean can tell you about, and tell you all about the Scottish military heroes that people don't really know too much about. So they go out and they basically crush resistance to slavery wherever they can in the British colonies. We're talking about Jamaica. They're very concerned about Jamaica because the Haitian Revolution had just kicked off next door in Saint-Domingue, which we're going to look at in a second. So they're going out to make sure to crush any kind of resistance, any kind of attempts for people to liberate themselves. And for me, this is more important when people are talking about, was he an abolitionist or was he not? We've got to think about this as an entire system. So for me, if I had the power to necessarily to change the plaque on the side of the Melville Monument, I wouldn't necessarily point the finger completely at him, because it's important for us to think about this as an entire system. There's so many people involved in propping up this system of enslavement, colonialism, and white supremacy. So let's go to the next one. So I imagine quite a few of you have been following this controversy. This is the old plaque on the left-hand side. So when St Andrew's Square, for those of you not from here, St Andrew's Square is right in the centre of Edinburgh, in the new town. And that was a place that was constructed for the middle classes at the end of the 18th century. And a lot of the money and profits that went to building that particular area of Edinburgh would have come from the East India Company. It would have come from, some of it would have come from Caribbean enslavement. And a lot of people that get compensated on emancipation, compensated for their so-called property, enslaved people that they've had working on the plantations. Very many of those addresses are showing up in the new town itself, which is not really a surprise. And of course, there would have been many people who have been involved in the slave trade system and would have sold up their plantations before emancipation. So on the left-hand side, we've got the old plaque here, which was really has no indication of Melville's role in two things. So one, orchestrating this kind of violence around the world, and two, the kinds of repressive laws that he and Prime Minister Pitt were also putting in place in places like Scotland affected Scottish white working class people and people in Edinburgh. So if we think about the Dundas riots that kick off in Edinburgh, George Square, 1792, and the King's birthday, a lot of the buildings that belong to the Melville family are getting smashed up by very angry people because the price of corn has just been put up, and Melville and Pitt are also responsible for this, and people are really suffering because of food insecurity due to land enclosures and so on. So there's absolutely no indication of this on this first plaque. Now we need to think about how controversial this statue was in the very beginning. So people really amazed to hear one of the original plans for the Melville Monument was to be on a massive Egyptian pyramid at the top of Arthur's Seat, to be seen there by as many people as possible and for as long as possible, hopefully forever. They shelved that idea, probably not that practical, those of you that know about our famous hill that we have in the middle of Edinburgh. They then decided to put it a bit further down in the new town, a whole lot of wrangling happening about who owned the land. They then decided they're going to put it in the middle of St Andrew's Square. And those of you who know it know how high it is. It's a really disproportionately large column based on the Trajan column in Rome. So the idea of the statues at the time in the new town was to try and celebrate Scotland's union with England, being part of the empire, and also to try and encourage Scottish aristocrats from going down to London to sort of boost the status of Edinburgh and kind of really focusing on links with Imperial Rome and Egypt and so on. So that was the idea of why he was on this huge column. Now, people at the time in the square were really concerned about that monument falling on the houses and smashing up the houses. They weren't too happy about it either. And that's why they brought in Stevenson, the engineer, to secure this statue, make sure it's not going to fall on them. So the plaque on the right-hand side, I've got a picture here of what was the proposed plaque and has now become the accepted plaque. And those of you who are in Edinburgh and you walk past the monument, haven't been there recently, the plaque is actually a tiny little plaque that you can actually hardly see. It got very weathered very early on. I went around with some of the curators who look after the statues in Edinburgh, which was interesting for me. And they were also quite surprised that a couple of weeks after it was up, it was very kind of weathered and looked like it'd been there for about 200 years as well. So, so if you want to investigate this further, have a look online, have a look at the new plaque, see what you think about it. And again, it's had quite a lot of resistance in lots of different areas, not just from some of the Melville family themselves. Now, some of the Melville family have actually been on my tours and I've talked to them. A lot of them are quite happy that this conversation is happening. They're not as invested in their own ancestors being some kind of heroic figure. But there are a few people whose identity is totally wrapped up with their ancestor being a really good and moral person and really quite upset by this whole thing. A lot of kickback from them. So that's just to give some greater context for folks that don't know about it too much. Now, bringing in the Haitian Revolution, and again, if you don't know too much about the Haitian Revolution, some of you might know quite a lot, go away and have a read about it, because I think when we're talking about enslavement, we're talking about the Scottish role in enslavement. Scots being disproportionately involved in the slave trade system in certain specific ways, but also involved in the abolition movement in really important ways as well. You get a lot of really interesting transatlantic, multiracial coalitions as well, with the Edinburgh Ladies Emancipation Society also working to assist people like Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad as well. So some really interesting kinds of links that happen and go on for decades fighting for freedom. So the Haitian Revolution kicks off 1791, August 1791. This is why on August 23rd every year, through UNESCO, it's considered to be the day of remembrance of the slave trade, and that's why they picked that particular day. Haitian Revolution is so interesting because this is a woman here called Cecil Fetterman, who was supposed to have been a voodoo priestess. She's using traditional African spirituality in order to create unity. She and another man called Dutty Bookman, who may also have been an Islamic scholar, are part of a ceremony that happens that night where people are swearing allegiance to one another to overthrow their oppressors, and remembering the French administered slave system that is set up in Haiti is one of the most brutal regimes in the world. And I don't have to go into details, but trust me, that's the case. What's interesting about Haitian Revolution is that they've managed to fight off, this shocked Europe, they fight off the British, the Spanish and the French armies. It's not much more complicated than that. But I think what it did is create shockwaves through Europe, that people were able to, formerly enslaved people were able to strategize in such a way that they were able to create the very first free Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere. Now, when I do my tours, I start at the Melville Monument. I use images of people. Some of them are actual paintings, some of them are imaginary versions, like this one, of the people that were integral to that revolution. So where does Melville fit into Haiti and France? Some people think that's, you know, a bit of an odd thing, like where does this fit? They understand that many Scots were involved in places like Jamaica, other islands like Grenada, also down in Guyana and South America. But when they are sending out this huge military mission, what they're doing is trying to reinstate chattel slavery. 1793, wars with France, spills over to the West Indies. They're now trying to reinstate chattel slavery in Haiti, where people have already declared themselves to be free. In 1794, with pressure from Haiti on France, the French revolutionaries have changed their mind. They were quite pro-slavery, just like the American Revolution was as well, that they decided to change their mind and declare that slavery is now illegal right through the French Empire. So for the Brits now to go and commit themselves to this really expensive army to go and reinstate chattel slavery really makes this whole debate about was he an abolitionist a bit ridiculous. So we'll go to the next one. We have another statue just outside RBS, so on the headquarters of Royal Bank of Scotland, also in St Andrews Square, so it's just across from the Melville Monument. He was the right-hand man to Sir Ralph Abercrombie, who's the main person, military leader of that huge mission. So in 1795, there's also another big rebellion, a war of resistance that happens in Grenada, which probably would have ended up in something similar to Haiti. Again, we're looking at a multiracial coalition of people, mixed race French planters, white French planters, and also enslaved African people who are joining up together against mainly Scottish people who are running, who are part of running that British colony at the time. So again, super complicated, don't have time to go into it, but it's important to know that the bank did decide to change or put up a new plaque to the Earl of Hopetoun in the courtyard as you're going into the bank. I go into that bank quite regularly as part of my tour. I was asking folks who work in there if they know who made those decisions to of what to put on the plaques. Because again, a lot of these decisions that are made around these plaques aren't always done in a way that's really transparent or in a way that is involving lots of different people, to different stakeholders to come in and make these decisions. Now, the new plaque that's just been put up here doesn't actually directly reference his role in going out to crush the Federal Rebellion in 1795, but it does sort of talk about his involvement in upholding the empire, which slavery was a part of. So this is a mock-up, imaginary picture of Julien Fedon, a mixed race planter who was one of the main leaders of that rebellion. So just showing you, it's important for us to look at images of other people who are on the other side of the fight. Now, the other part that links into Melville, and on the new plaque, it does talk about crushing resistance by Indigenous people. We have this man here called Joseph Chatouillet of the island of St. Vincent. He was the leader of the Garifuna people, and the Garifuna people were a community, a blended community of African and Indigenous people, and they resisted British encroachment against mostly Scots involved in this, keep encroaching on their land, signing the British signed a treaty with them to say they weren't going to do this. What a surprise, they break the treaty and they keep moving in on their land. Eventually, Joseph Chatouillet is killed by a Scotsman called Colonel Lee Hay, and his brother is also killed. And what they start to do is now remove 5,000 people from the north of St. Vincent, where people's traditional lands are, and move them to this tiny island called Balacio. And Balacio is a tiny island in the Grenadines, those islands between St. Vincent and Grenada, and basically just dump people. So it's talking about children, women, and men, and only about half of those people survived that experience, being dumped on this island. It's kind of like a concentration camp. And Henry Melville writes a letter to the governor at the time and says, we now need to move the rest of these survivors from this island and move them somewhere else. So they put them on 8 different ships and they take them down to these islands just off Honduras. So what's important about this really horrific story is that the Garifuna people still remember the exile orchestrated by Henry Melville in 1797. So it's important for us to remember that a lot of this history is very well remembered and very well discussed in other areas of the world. But again, not many people in Scotland know too much about the Garifuna, or if anything about Garifuna people. And actually, I'm helping to organise an event at the end of August with a delegation of Garifuna people who want to come to Scotland to have these kinds of conversations. So what's been good about the statue debates, some can say that it's very surface, it's really about symbolism, that we need to also make sure that it's not taking us away from really pushing for real change, the legacies from this period in terms of, let's say, racism in Scotland, as an example, or the underdevelopment of the Caribbean. What it has done is encourage these kinds of further dialogue, which is good. David Hume, we've got this very polite Edinburgh protest here. Again, this happened summer of 2020, where there's this piece of cardboard put up highlighting the really like the ultimate footnote in white supremacist ideology that David Hume puts on one of his essays in 1753 on national characters. And I don't necessarily have to read this out here, but trust me, it is basically what he says is that white people are the only people in the world who have managed to create any kind of worthy civilization, arts or sciences, or capable of doing so. And that's the important part, that he says that white people are naturally superior to everyone else. And these kinds of ideas are important because they get picked up by people like Thomas Jefferson in America, who writes a book in 1780. He's thinking about after enslavement of African people in America, then we're going to deport people because black and white people cannot live side by side. And these kinds of ideas come directly from people like David Hume. And something he writes in that book is almost like almost word for word at this footnote that Hume writes. What's important about this is that timing of this statue, because you might look at this statue and think, oh, wow, this statue looks like it's been there for a couple hundred years, right? Or even more. Actually, this statue was put up in 1997. And part of the reason it was put up in 1997 was because, of course, the Scottish Parliament, the devolved the devolved Parliament, a celebration of Scotland, and that's the reason why it was put up at that particular time. There's been a lot of debate about the David Hume Tower at the university. Quite a lot of the Black students feel that venerating somebody who has these kinds of ideas that Black people are lesser than everyone else creates a kind of environment that is oppressive, and where Black people and people of colour are still considered to be lesser than white people. So again, we might want to talk about that after. But important to remember that statues in the Caribbean are often of freedom fighters, and are very often the same people who are fighting against the policies and also direct military action of people that we continue to venerate in Edinburgh. So for example, here, this is in Georgetown, in the capital of Guyana, outside the bank again, showing a man called Kwame Gladstone, who was one of the leaders of one of the serious wars of resistance that happens on one of John Gladstone of Leith's plantations, several of the plantations, but some belonging to Gladstone. So this happens in 1823. He is executed, his son is exiled. He's here now venerated as a freedom fighter. And Sir John Gladstone of Leith is the person who received the biggest payout on that compensation list. So for more than 2,000 people that he'd enslaved all the way from Jamaica to Guyana on various plantations, and receives a payout equivalent to £83 million in our money today. So just showing you that connection again directly with Edinburgh and Leith. Now, if we're thinking about other memorials, like I said, the memory of Joseph Chatouet in St. Vincent is still very live, not just with Garifuna people who were exiled and have now spread out right through, sometimes against their will, right across Central America. There's a lot of Garifuna people in New York, and also quite a few folks in London, some in Edinburgh as well, knowing that this history is very live and remembered. Partly because the kind of oppression that Garifuna people and other Indigenous people still receive in the area today. And I think this is what is important. Why people feel so strongly about this is because the legacies from this period are still not resolved. And I think if we got to a point where people are not discriminated against, they're not oppressed, where people are equal, that people are not going to feel so strongly about a statue that's still commemorating that kind of oppression in present day. So if we see here, one of the ceremonies that happens on National Heroes Day, March the 14th, when Chatouet was killed. This is an obelisk that was put up to him. It's quite an odd looking monument, very plain looking monument. See that on the right hand side. And there's lots of calls for an actual statue of Chatouet to be placed in this area as well. And of course, there are various other memorials right across the Caribbean that memorialize murder. So on the left-hand side, we have a monument that was put up to the victims of the Zong Massacre, which some of you might know of, which happened in 1781 with a British crew who had taken out insurance on the lives of people they were trafficking across the Atlantic. They said that they ran out of water, they didn't have enough water for people, and again, horrible massacre occurred where they're throwing people overboard. And this is a memorial that's placed in Jamaica where the survivors ended up eventually after going through that trauma. Now on the right hand side we have a man called Bussa. Bussa was one of the leaders of rebellion that happened in Barbados at the very turn of the 19th century. And again, we might want to think about how we can incorporate this kind of memorialization in a place like Edinburgh. If we're not taking down a statue, would it make sense to have statues of abolitionists or freedom fighters? Or might that create a situation where you're creating a kind of false equivalence between one person and another? That's something we need to think about as well. Now, sometimes you get these unexpected memorials. This is something that shows up on the internet quite a bit. Now, because I lived in Grenada, my mom's from Grenada and lived there for 20 years, I know about this and I know when this was, when this memorial came about. Now, these are a series of underwater sculptures, beautiful sculptures that are in the Marine Park in the western side of Grenada. And actually on the internet, and I think generally people consider this to be a memorial to to the transatlantic slave trade and to the Middle Passage and the people that didn't survive the Middle Passage. But actually, this was never intended to be this in the first place. This was supposed to be an ecological commission. It was based on boys and girls that he'd met in Grenada as a Guyanese British sculptor called Jason de Caires. And what it has done, though, is taken on a life of its own, where people kind of ascribe their own meaning to this. And so most people consider this now to be a memorial to the victims of the Middle Passage, which is an interesting one. Lots of statues coming down all over the world. So here we have Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, on the left-hand side, just become a republic. And in the process of the lead up to Barbados becoming a republic, the column of Nelson was taken down in a really beautiful ceremony, in fact. So a lot of talk gone on about it, a lot of discussion gone on about it, and a really beautiful cultural ceremony to mark the occasion of bringing Nelson down. And so she was saying that symbolically it's important for a place that, you know, majority Black, where people have come from a history of enslavement, to not continue to venerate colonial statues or people that supported slavery. On the right-hand side, we have a picture of the statue of Queen Elizabeth, face down. And this was part of a protest by Indigenous Canadians who, of course, were horrified at hearing the stories of the children who had died in the residential schools as well. And the fact that it was going on so late that it was still happening in the reign of Queen Elizabeth as well. So the statue came down as part of that. So Indigenous people are really starting to take action all the way around the world. We've got Captain Cook here in Australia, daubed with red blood, daubed with red paint to symbolise blood and to symbolise the kind of effects that European colonialism has had on the Indigenous people of Australia. On the right-hand side, we have a picture of a priest in Mexico, was also taken down, and the effects of this particular statue that symbolised, had Indigenous people basically being forced to carry stone blocks by this particular priest, again symbolising this kind of oppressive labour conditions of Indigenous people that are still fighting for their rights today. There have been memorials to freedom fighters in Europe, which is an interesting way to go. If we were thinking about doing this in a place like Edinburgh, which I think we could. We've got Toussaint Louverture here, who was the first leader of the Haitian Revolution. This is in Bordeaux. Bordeaux, like Nantes in France, was one of those major ports that were part of the transatlantic slave trade system. This was actually a gift from the people of Haiti to the city. And he's looking out onto the river, and this is the actual river where ships would have left and gone to West Africa and been part of the Middle Passage. We've also got this one, the first statue of a Black woman to be put up in Denmark, a woman called Mary Thomas, sometimes known as Queen Mary. She was the leader of a workers' rebellion in 1878, so we're talking about 30 years after emancipation happens, in the Danish West Indies. We don't always think about Denmark being part of this as well. And what's interesting about this statue was constructed from a three-dimensional blending of two artist bodies. So one woman who was in Denmark and somebody who was in St. Croix in the Danish, what was the Danish West Indies, and blending blending the images of their two bodies in something that's really symbolic in terms of healing, in a way, for people from either side of the Atlantic. I'm just going to finish here with ideas that we could have for using new technology. And this is something that I throw out quite often without really looking at the practicalities of it. But this is an example of a hologram of an Indian anti-colonial leader, Netaji Bose. And this was put up by the Prime Minister of India, who can be very problematic as well, and not being, somebody who's has been criticised very rightly for doing this by certain activists and lawyers. A couple of hundred people who signed a letter to say, actually, we shouldn't just be putting up a statue to one particular person, because his politics can be very divisive. even in terms of religious terms and other things. But also their idea was to rotate a range of historical figures. So if you're using this hologram here, which looks pretty realistic, looks like a real statue, that you could use projectors potentially to rotate a range of different historical figures in order to be inclusive and in order to make sure that you're referencing lots of different kinds of people in these struggles for freedom. So if we want to think about this in an Edinburgh context, we could potentially, if we had the money to do it and the will to do it, for example, you could, let's say if you decided to take the statue at the top of the column down from the Melville monument, what could you put in its place? Maybe you would want to rotate different figures. Maybe this could be a really interesting tourist attraction. This could be a really good way of bringing young people in Edinburgh into the conversation about what they would want on the top of that statue. Or like we came back to that original question, if you had a statue that symbolized unity, what could that be? Maybe it's a group of different kind of people that symbolize different things. Maybe it's not people at all. Maybe it's some kind of artwork that symbolizes unity in some other kind of way. So this talk is really just to throw out some different ideas, just to get us all thinking perhaps in different ways and get out of this idea of it has to be one thing or another thing. Is it going to be a plaque? Is it going to be taking down the statue? Those sorts of other things we can do. The other important thing that I want to end with, though, one, I think it is important to think about the fact that if you know this history and you're somebody who's from those ancestral communities who were affected by this kind of violence, your communities are still getting affected by that violence in different ways and the legacy of that. And that these are memorializing an idea of certain people being lesser than others and not being full citizens, at the time not considered to be human beings. We're talking about African peoples, part of the transatlantic slave system. Having said that, and again, it's also important to remember that people around the world still remember this history, and visitors who are coming here from those countries are often quite disturbed going into a museum and not seeing their history being represented correctly, or maybe violence against their communities being celebrated in a way that's very problematic. It's now starting to change. The important thing, though, is that this symbolic changes are important, but it mustn't be at the expense of very real change. And this is something the Bristol mayor has even said himself. So if we think about the kinds of racism, for example, that happened in Edinburgh schools, there was a report came out recently that was highly sanitized, actually, about the kinds of what I would see as a culture of racism actually encouraged often by a lack of action by teachers across schools. Thinking about our involvement in the arms trade, the fact that Britain is the second biggest exporter of arms, we don't talk about that very much. And also, sometimes people want to talk about modern slavery as a diversion from talking about this kind of history that we haven't really dealt with and haven't really dealt with the legacies from. But again, there's no reason why we shouldn't use these kinds of conversations in a mature way to think about the kinds of oppressions that we are still complicit in, actually, as a British society today. So I'm going to end there. There's lots to think about. It's very early in the morning. I think my brain is finally engaged. So thanks very much. I'm going to finish there, and if anyone wants to ask questions, now's your time.
Lisa, thank you so much for that. Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat, if you don't mind. Yeah, thank you so much for such an engaging, such an informative talk. I'm sure lots and lots of things for us to think about and ruminate on. But yeah, Sarah, have you got some questions for Lisa in the chat?
I do, and there's like really kind of not just questions, but people engaging really well. Inga shared some really interesting kind of personal perspective from being a person from Cape Town, and how South African history is kind of not very well represented, and yeah, all sorts of really interesting things. I wanted to ask a question from Andy, who wants to know, are there any examples of modern statues designed to celebrate a specific person? And if so, is there some sort of ethical framework which helps someone evaluate whether the statue should be erected? And that kind of touches on your last slide a little bit, but are there any kind of permanent monuments, and how do we make decisions about who we should put those up for?
That's a really hard question. I mean, the more democratic it can be, the better, right? I think sometimes we run into problems when we kind of rush ahead of ourselves a little bit to make changes. Some of it is knee-jerk reactions to the greater awareness of the Black Lives Matter movement, the racist murder of George Floyd and others. And it's sad that, that it took, I have to say this now, that it's very sad that it took further murders of Black people by police in order for us to be talking about this. But having said that, I think that we're really at we're really at the beginning of a journey to coming to terms with Britain's role in empire. South Africa, I can't comment on. Of course, if I had more time, I would have put in the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which of course had reverberations here in Britain before 2020, of course, in Oxford with Cecil Rhodes' statue. Again, that's still very contested about what's going on with that. I think it's difficult for us to make decisions democratically until we're fairly well informed. So I think, for example, I feel a bit traitorous to Edinburgh right now, but in Glasgow, for example, they're doing a very, very thorough audit by a historian with Glasgow's links to enslavement, and I'm sure they'll do another one with colonialism later on as well. I think until we have a lot more facts, we're really well informed, and this is young people, older people, people in the community, I think you need to spend a couple of years like really thrashing out what this stuff actually means, what really meant for Britain, how it's built up Britain at the expense of other places around the world, right? Who are ex-colonies, and same goes for other European colonies that were colonized by other European countries. I think it's difficult for us to make those decisions until we have a lot of facts at our disposal. I think this is where the hologram thing can be really useful, because you can change things. You can, and I think also I'm going off topic a wee bit, but for example, I'm involved in hearing about the new designs for George Street. Those of you not from Edinburgh, that's in the new town, just to the street that takes us off St Andrew Square where the Melville Monument is. And there's many statues along there. And I think in the in the new planning process for the new design of George Street, there's a really good opportunity, even if you're putting up could be potentially quite ugly sort of security bollards that need to be put up for security purposes, that you could have these as temporary statues that are commissioned, and then people could change their minds about things. They could decide on what, you could put something different every year. I think maybe we need to get away from this idea of choosing something that we might want to keep there for the next 200 years, because we're constantly changing our minds and we're updating our information. I don't know if I'm answering your question properly or not. But I do think it's important for us to remember the role of South African activists in this whole debate around monuments as well, actually, and how important that's been for us here as well. Maybe you could just repeat that question for me again, please, to make sure I have answered it properly, because I think I maybe haven't.
Oh, the question was, are there any examples of modern statues designed to celebrate a specific person? And if so, is there an ethical framework that helps someone evaluate if the statue should be erected? I think you have kind of answered quite a lot around that, at least.
Yeah, around it is right. I'm dodging that.
It's tricky. I don't know if there is an answer.
I'd have to really think about that a lot more, actually. I think what's difficult, even just to try and put information on a very small plaque, is really, really hard to do without kind of, there's getting away from this idea of the balance sheet and where we decide how we decide what balance actually means. And I think that's something that's really important for us to interrogate. So for example, you might find a plaque in a museum where you've got a guy. Okay, I'm going to just talk about there's a plaque next to a painting in the National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, and it's a really notorious enslaver called Robert Cunningham Graham of Gartmore. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details of what he did. Horrible. People who were working on his plantations are very, very low life expectancy and all kinds of things. So originally that was framed as, although he supported human rights, later on, originally he was an enslaver that did this, this and this. And there's very often this pressure, often people working in the heritage industry, to create some kind of balance. I think it's really for us important to interrogate what we mean by that and whether one thing is equivalent to another. For example, you wouldn't expect a really, let's say, someone who was a notorious Nazi who did really terrible things. You wouldn't expect to have a statue venerating them and saying, oh, they did great things for science, but they also did this, right? You wouldn't see that, right? You wouldn't expect to see that. So I think we need to think about how we're creating this idea of balance on a plaque or memorial. Ethical standards as to what you would put up for a statue. I think we also need to get away from this idea of making one person a hero. We need to think about movements. Like, so for example, Frederick Douglass, a really, really important formerly enslaved person. He went on to be this big civil rights leader, did all sorts of incredible things, be a philosopher, statesman, and so on. But also thinking about, like when Celeste Marie Bernier did her exhibition about Frederick Douglass here in Edinburgh, 2018, really looking at him as very much supported by his first wife, Anna Murray, his daughters, his sons, not just the family, but the whole community, and how the whole community come together to support each other in a movement. So we need to be careful when we're venerating one particular person, because I think that also encourages us not to think about our own personal power and how we connect as a community to create change as well. So I think that's one thing that's probably important to